Welcome to the History Maps podcast. If you hand someone a map of a city they have never visited, but you tell them with absolute certainty that it is a treasure map, they will read every single street sign completely wrong.
Oh, they will look at a bakery and see a gold vault.
Yeah, they will look at a busy intersection and see a trap.
Right. They will navigate an entire functioning world blind to what is actually there just because their expectations have overwritten reality.
Which is a profound cognitive dissonance.
It really is. I mean, when an individual possesses a predetermined objective, that objective filters all incoming data.
They only process the information that serves the goal.
Precisely. And they actively discard or, just misinterpret anything that contradicts it.
So today, for you listening, we are tracking perhaps the most consequential example of that cognitive dissonance in North American history.
We are looking at the 1539 to 1543 expedition led by Hernando de Soto.
Yeah, the mission for this deep dive into the source material is to trace a 4-year, 4,000-mile march through what is now the southeastern United States.
And we are going to examine how a relentless quest for gold turned into a grueling ordeal.
It really did. And we will explore how it provided the first, and in some ways the last, European glimpse into the complex Mississippian cultures before they fundamentally transformed.
To understand this event, we rely on a synthesis of distinct sources.
Right. We have 4 first-hand chronicles that survived the expedition, written by participants or contemporaries.
Crucially, we pair those 16th century documents with modern archaeological findings.
Which is so important because it allows us to reconstruct a highly complex historical reality.
Yeah, it separates the political narratives and justifications of the era from the actual physical evidence left in the soil.
So we cannot understand the expedition without understanding the man leading it.
No, you really cannot.
Let us look at Hernando de Soto. According to the sources, he was born around 1500 in the Spanish province of Badajoz.
Though, there is a bit of a historical dispute about the specific town of his birth.
Right, I saw that. The towns of Badajoz, Barcarota, and Jerez de los Caballeros all have historical claims.
Yeah, but testamentary evidence, specifically Soto's own will, stipulated that he wished to be interred in Jerez de los Caballeros alongside his noble ancestors.
Which strongly supports Jerez as his origin.
It does. He was born to Francisco Mendez de Soto and Leonor Arias Tinoco.
And their social standing is a critical piece of the puzzle here for you to understand. They were hidalgos.
Right. Hidalgos were minor nobility.
They held a certain social prestige.
They did, and the sources note they were old Christians.
Which meant what in that context?
Well, in the context of 16th century Spain, following the Reconquista, proving that your lineage was free of Moorish or Jewish descent carried significant weight.
But crucially, holding the title of minor nobility often meant they were of modest financial means.
Yes, and furthermore, as a second son, Soto was subject to the laws of primogeniture.
Meaning he was not in line to inherit the family estate.
Correct. He got nothing.
So you have a young man with a title, a sense of noble destiny, but no actual wealth to his name.
None at all.
Plus, he is growing up in a region, Extremadura, that is arid and impoverished by years of continuous warfare.
It is the perfect recipe to create a young man looking across the ocean for a way to make his mark.
That lack of inheritance was a powerful impetus.
It really drove a whole generation of young men from that specific region to the New World, seeking military fame and fortunes.
And Soto arrived in Central America in 1514.
Essentially as a teenager.
Yeah, serving under Pedro Arias Davila in what is now Panama.
And he builds quite the resume there.
The sources detail how he earned wealth in Nicaragua and Panama.
He was involved in the Indian slave trade, extracting resources from mines and utilizing encomiendas.
We should probably define that for clarity. What is an encomienda?
An encomienda was a legal system employed by the Spanish crown. It was a royal grant that essentially gave a specific Spaniard control over the indigenous labor and tribute of a particular geographic area.
So, theoretically, the encomendero was supposed to protect the native people and instruct them in the Catholic faith.
Theoretically, yes. But in practice, it functioned as an institutionalized system of brutal forced labor and resource extraction.
And Soto leveraged this system effectively to build his early fortune.
He did, but the real turning point in his career, the event that makes him a highly wealthy man, happens in Peru.
Right. He joins Francisco Pizarro in the conquest of the Incan Empire.
He played a pivotal tactical role there, particularly in the capture of the Incan ruler Atahualpa.
The sources note the staggering scale of the ransom Atahualpa offered to secure his freedom.
Oh, it was immense. He promised to fill a large room once with gold and twice with silver.
To put that in perspective for you, we're talking about thousands of pounds of precious metals stripped from temples and palaces.
And Soto received the third largest share of that ransom.
So when he returned to Spain in 1537, he was no longer an impoverished second son.
No, he was incredibly wealthy.
If we think of Soto's early career, he operated much like a ruthless corporate ladder climber or a venture capitalist warlord.
That is a good way to look at it. He took immense personal, physical risks in Panama and Nicaragua, aggressively expanded his operations, and finally secured the ultimate payout in Peru.
He goes back to Spain rich, he marries, he has more money than he could ever spend in a lifetime.
Right.
Why would someone who already has more money than he could ever spend risk it all on an unknown swamp?
It comes down to the psychological profile of the conquistador. In that society, wealth alone was not sufficient.
They wanted more than money.
Yes, the ultimate goal was prestige, hereditary titles, and territorial governance.
So Soto petitioned King Charles V for the right to conquer and settle La Florida.
And at the time, La Florida did not just mean the modern peninsula.
It meant the entire unexplored landmass north of Mexico.
Right. He was driven by the prevailing, unquestioned belief that another empire, one as rich and centralized as the Inca or the Aztec, must exist further north.
His previous successes just completely blinded him to the realities of North America.
He did. He assumes the continent will yield to him just as Central America and Peru did.
He assumes he will find cities of stone and vaults of gold.
And that hubris directly shaped the expedition he assembled next.
Because he was personally financing a substantial portion of it with his Peruvian wealth, right?
Yes, so he built a force of unprecedented scale and ambition.
Let us look at the logistics of this launch, because this invasion begins in 1539, and the sheer mechanical effort of moving this group is staggering.
He gathers a diverse force of 600 to 800 people.
This roster includes Spaniards, Portuguese, enslaved and free Africans, and enslaved and free Native Americans brought from previous campaigns.
And because the explicit goal was permanent colonization, not merely a scouting mission, he brought a wide array of expert tradesmen.
Let's unpack this for a second. They didn't pack light. With pigs, war dogs, and blacksmiths, this wasn't a scouting party. This was a heavily armed mobile city invading the landscape.
That is exactly what it was. The roster included carpenters, blacksmiths, merchants, engineers, farmers, and Catholic priests.
And they were equipped with substantial military hardware.
Crossbows, arquebuses, and thousands of pounds of iron tools.
Then there is the livestock. Transporting animals across the Atlantic in the 16th century was incredibly difficult, yet they brought over 200 horses.
Horses were Andalusians, and they served as terrifying military assets.
Because cavalry was entirely unknown there.
Right. In a landscape where cavalry was unknown, a mounted armored soldier was a devastating weapon against infantry.
Alongside the horses, they brought fierce war dogs.
These were large breeds, mastiffs and greyhounds, specifically trained for combat.
And frequently used for punishing captives or hunting down individuals who attempted to escape the Spanish camps.
Yeah. And then, of course, a large herd of pigs.
The pigs. Why pigs?
Well, the pigs acted essentially as a mobile food reserve. They are hardy animals that can forage in almost any environment.
And their rapid reproduction rate meant the herd could sustain the army as they marched.
However, the ecological impact of introducing hundreds of rooting pigs into the delicate ecosystems of the Southeast was highly disruptive to local flora and indigenous agricultural plots.
So they land on May 30, 1539, near the Tampa Bay area.
Right away, they acquire an asset that proves invaluable.
They find Juan Ortiz.
Yes, Juan Ortiz was a Spanish survivor of the earlier failed Narvaez expedition from 1528.
He had lived among the local Native American tribes for over a decade.
The chronicles indicate he survived initially because a local chief's daughter intervened to save him from execution.
Over the subsequent years, he integrated into the society and learned multiple regional dialects.
For Soto, finding a European who could translate the complex political and geographic information of the local tribes was a significant strategic advantage.
They march inland and set up their first winter camp at a place called Enjaica, which was a principal Appalachian village.
For a long time, historians argued about the exact geographical location of this camp.
But then came a big discovery.
In March 1987, an archaeologist named B. Calvin Jones made a critical discovery near modern-day Tallahassee, Florida.
This location became known as the Governor Martin site.
Right. Jones was investigating a property slated for development and uncovered 16th century Spanish artifacts.
What specifically did they find that proved this was Soto's camp?
Excavations eventually recovered tens of thousands of artifacts. They found chainmail links, iron crossbow quarrels, copper coins dating to the early 16th century, and distinctive Spanish olive jar fragments.
So the concentration and specific dating of these materials definitively confirmed this location as Anheka.
Yes, the expedition's first winter encampment of 1539 to 1540.
While they are at Anheka and moving through the Florida Panhandle, we see Soto's operational methodology on full display.
It is highly systemic.
He utilizes a scorched earth policy that he learned and perfected in Central America and Peru.
Upon approaching a new territory, Soto would execute a specific tactical maneuver.
He would systematically abduct the paramount chieftain of the local society.
He did.
How does abducting one individual paralyze an entire society?
We have to understand the political structure of the Mississippian cultures. These were highly centralized chiefdoms.
Right.
The paramount chief was not just a political leader. He was often viewed as a divine or semi-divine figure.
An earthly representative of the sun or the ancestors.
Yes, his authority held the entire social and religious fabric together. By capturing the chief and holding him hostage, the Spanish effectively neutralized any coordinated military resistance.
The indigenous population would not attack the Spanish for fear of killing their own divine leader.
Exactly. I mean, that is spot on.
Soto uses these captive leaders as human shields to guarantee safe passage through the region and to extort food and resources from the local population.
And he also routinely enslaves local Native Americans, chaining them together and forcing them to serve as porters, to carry the expedition's heavy equipment, or to act as guides.
Consider the perspective of the indigenous peoples encountering this force. They were facing an entirely alien, highly mobile society.
The Spaniards were clad in steel armor, riding large, unfamiliar beasts, utilizing aggressive war dogs, and wielding weapons that fired with the sound of thunder.
And they arrived demanding two things above all else: total political submission and precious metals.
But despite wintering successfully at Anheka, the promised gold was nowhere to be found.
They are consuming vast amounts of stored maize, they are taking captives, but the mineral wealth is entirely absent.
The lack of wealth created severe operational pressure within the expedition.
Soto began relying heavily on the rumors provided by his captive guides.
And these guides, operating under extreme duress, would repeatedly tell the Spaniards that great cities of gold lay just a bit further away.
Usually in the territory of a neighboring tribe.
Right. This psychological leverage pushed Soto to break camp in the spring of 1540 and march his mobile city deep into the unknown interior.
We move into the spring of 1540, what we can call the interior loop.
They marched northeast into what is now Georgia.
They are following a native youth they call Perico, who promises them that a kingdom of gold is just 4 days to the east.
This pursuit leads them directly into a severe logistical crisis. They cross into an expansive, uninhabited region that the Spanish chroniclers referred to as the Desert of Ocute.
When we hear desert, we think of sand dunes. What was this region actually like?
Well, ecologically, it was likely a vast expanse of pine barrens.
Not a sandy desert.
No, but politically it functioned as a deliberate buffer zone.
Mississippian chiefdoms often maintained large, uninhabited tracts of land between their territories and the territories of their rivals.
These buffer zones were rich in wildlife for hunting, but they lacked the dense agricultural settlements required to feed an invading army of hundreds of men, horses, and pigs.
The army faced near starvation in this desolate landscape.
They also had to navigate a treacherous crossing of the Savannah River during its spring flood stage,
Pulling heavy barges across a swollen, unpredictable torrent.
Modern archaeological evidence supports this specific route through Georgia. Anthropologist Dennis Blanton made a substantial discovery at what is called the Glass Site in Telfair County, Georgia.
Blanton's team recovered specific 16th century artifacts that correlate directly with the Soto Expedition. What makes these artifacts the smoking gun for archaeologists?
The artifacts included iron tools, a silver pendant, and crucially, chevron glass beads.
Why are those beads so important?
Chevron beads are highly diagnostic artifacts. They were manufactured in Venice using a complex, multi-layered glass blowing technique.
That created a distinctive star pattern visible at the ends of the bead.
Crucially, specific styles of these beads were only manufactured for a limited period in the mid-16th century.
And they were frequently utilized as trade goods by early Spanish explorers.
Finding these specific beads, concentrated within what appears to be the remains of a large Native American council house, provides concrete physical evidence of the expedition's passage through that specific geographical point.
After surviving the buffer zone, they arrive at the chiefdom of Cofidichequi, near present-day Camden, South Carolina.
They are greeted by a female leader known in the chronicles as the Lady of Cofidichequi.
She presents Soto with gifts of high status in her culture: animal pelts, pearls, mica, and copper.
But no gold.
The copper and mica were highly valued by the Mississippian cultures for crafting ceremonial objects and elite adornments.
However, they held absolutely no economic interest for the Spaniards, who were exclusively seeking gold and silver.
Frustrated, Soto's men plunder the sacred temple mounds of Cofidichequi,
They loot ornate chests filled with the bones of honored ancestors.
specifically to steal the thousands of freshwater pearls stored within them.
True to his central methodology, Soto then takes the chieftainess hostage to ensure his army's safe passage north.
The chronicles record that she later managed to escape, reportedly fleeing into the dense mountains with an enslaved African man named Gomez, who had been brought with the expedition.
The Spanish force presses on, moving north into North Carolina. They halt to rest at a large Native American town called Juara.
This is a highly significant location known archaeologically as the Berry Site, located near Morganton in Burke County.
Excavations led by archaeologists David Moore, Robin Beck, and Chris Rodning have demonstrated this was a major Burke phase settlement.
Let us clarify what a Burke phase settlement means for the listener.
In archaeology, a phase refers to a specific, localized cultural expression defined by distinct pottery styles, architectural patterns, and time periods.
So the Burke phase represents the Mississippian culture operating in the Upper Catawba River Valley during this era.
Soto rested his army here for several days in May 1540 before attempting to cross the rugged Appalachian Mountains.
What makes Juara particularly notable is the historical continuity.
Yes, 27 years later, in 1567, another Spanish explorer named Juan Pardo would arrive at this very same site.
And he would build Fort San Juan, attempting to establish the permanent colonial presence that Soto failed to achieve.
They continue over the Blue Ridge Mountains into Tennessee, following established indigenous trade routes, specifically the Great War and Trading Path, heading toward a town called Chiaja.
As we look at the primary sources regarding this segment of the march, a very clear, deliberate pattern emerges.
Soto continually interrogates his captives, employing torture to extract the truth about where the gold is located.
Here is where it gets really interesting for you. Soto is being played.
He really is.
He thinks he's interrogating his captives, but these indigenous leaders are brilliantly using his own greed to point him toward their enemies.
It was a highly sophisticated survival strategy. The local tribal leadership quickly deduced the underlying psychology of the Spanish force.
They were a destructive, resource-heavy entity entirely fixated on precious metals.
They recognize his overwhelming greed, and they brilliantly use it against him. They point him away from their own vulnerable agricultural centers and directly toward the territories of their political enemies.
By insisting that the vast wealth Soto sought was located just a few days' march away, specifically within a rival chief's domain, they manipulated the Spanish army into leaving their lands quickly.
This strategy minimized the devastating extraction of their stored maize and the disruption of their populations.
Soto moves from one promised golden city to the next, finding nothing but vast fields of corn, complex political structures, and ceremonial copper.
This endless goose chase eventually leads him south, down into the territory of modern-day Alabama.
Here, he enters the jurisdiction of a chief who decides against the tactic of misdirection.
This chief opts for direct, calculated confrontation.
This brings us to October 1540 and the entry into the Coosa chiefdom.
Here, Soto encounters the paramount chief, Tuscaloosa.
The Spanish chronicles describe Tuscaloosa as a man of towering physical presence, seated on a balcony, exhibiting immense authority and complete stoicism in the face of the Spanish cavalry.
Soto, following his standard rigid playbook, demands 400 porters and 100 women from Tuscaloosa.
The chief appears to agree. He states that he will provide the labor and resources, but they must travel to his certified border town of Mobila to collect them.
Soto's vanguard arrived at Mobila on October 18, 1540.
The town was heavily fortified, enclosed by a formidable double-palisaded wooden wall, complete with defensive bastions, towers, and portholes specifically designed for archers.
It was not a typical agricultural village. It was a purpose-built military stronghold.
Soto enters the town with a small detachment of his men, leaving the main body of the army outside.
Tuscaloosa goes into a house and simply refuses to come out or speak with Soto.
Then, the trap is sprung. Thousands of native warriors who had been secretly gathered and hidden inside the structures launch an overwhelming, coordinated assault.
It initiated a relentless, intensely brutal 9-hour battle.
The Spanish vanguard was initially overwhelmed and driven back outside the walls.
However, the Spanish possessed a distinct tactical advantage in their armor and their horses.
Let us examine that armor. It wasn't just steel, was it?
No, many of the Spaniards had adopted a type of thick, quilted cotton armor called escupol, adapted from Mesoamerican designs.
Because in the humid heat of the southeast, heavy steel armor was exhausting to wear and could actually bake the soldier inside.
The dense quilted cotton was highly effective at stopping or slowing indigenous arrows.
Furthermore, the speed, mass, and power of the cavalry allowed Soto's forces to regroup, rally outside the walls, and launch a devastating counteroffensive.
They repeatedly charged the indigenous formations, eventually breached the wooden palisades, and deliberately set the town on fire.
The casualty numbers reported in the sources are staggering.
For the Spaniards, estimates range between 20 and 200 dead and over 150 wounded.
Including Soto himself, who took an arrow to the face.
But for the Native Americans, the estimates range from 2,000 to 6,000 killed in the fierce hand-to-hand fighting and the subsequent fire that consumed the fortified town.
It remains one of the bloodiest single days in North American history.
Beyond the catastrophic human toll, the strategic implications of the Battle of Mobile were absolutely devastating for the Spanish mission.
In the chaos and the widespread fire, the expedition lost almost all of their vital logistical support.
They lost their spare clothing, their remaining medical supplies, their specialized tools.
And critically, they lost all the freshwater pearls they had looted from Kofi de Cheki in the fire.
They won the tactical engagement, but they lost everything required to prove the economic viability of their mission.
So they just won the bloodiest battle on the continent, but they lost everything they needed to prove their mission was a success. What does this all mean for their morale?
Without the pearls or any physical proof of wealth, Soto had nothing to show potential investors or colonists back in Spain. The morale was completely shattered.
The men were severely wounded, exhausted, destitute, and questioning the fundamental purpose of the endeavor.
At this critical juncture, Soto makes a fateful, deeply desperate decision.
He learned from indigenous informants that his supply ships, commanded by Francisco Maldonado, were anchored at the Gulf Coast in Mobile Bay, just a few days' march to the south.
Salvation, fresh supplies, and a route home are right there.
Precisely. But Soto understood the psychology of his men.
He knew that if his battered, disillusioned army reached those ships, they would immediately mutiny, desert the mission, and sail back to Cuba.
The expedition would end in undeniable failure.
And Soto would return to Spain, bankrupt, stripped of his prestige, and humiliated.
Rather than admit defeat, he deliberately hides the information about the ships from his own army.
He forces them to turn their backs on the coast and orders them to march northwest, back into the uncharted, hostile interior.
He prioritized his own ego and the increasingly delusional hope of finding another Incan empire over the survival of his men.
He plunged his bleeding, unequipped army directly into the approaching winter, just to maintain the illusion of the conquest.
It set the stage for an even greater logistical disaster.
They march into the territory of the Chickasaw, establishing a winter camp at a place called Chicaca in modern-day Mississippi.
They spend the harsh winter of 1540 to 1541 there.
Relations sour when Soto, true to form as spring approaches, falls back on his demands.
He requires 200 porters from the Chickasaw leadership to carry what little gear they have left.
The Chickasaw leadership refuses to comply. On March 3, 1541, they launch a highly coordinated pre-dawn night attack.
They utilize flaming arrows to set fire to the Spanish encampment.
The Chickasaw clearly observed Spanish vulnerabilities during the winter. They knew the horses were tied up and the men were asleep.
The attack is devastating. 12 Spaniards are killed, along with 60 horses and a large portion of their vital pig herd, which burns in the pins.
The fire also consumed the very last of the clothing, saddles, and weapons they had managed to salvage from Mobile.
The Spanish were reduced to a state of absolute destitution.
They were forced to weave temporary clothing from tall grasses and wear the raw skins of animals they hunted just to survive the lingering cold.
They had to hastily forge new weapons and armor, using bellows made from bearskins and melting down whatever scrap iron they could recover from the ashes.
They are limping westward now, a ragged, desperate force.
On May 8, 1541, this battered group of men wearing animal skins reaches the Mississippi River.
The sources place this arrival somewhere near modern-day Memphis or further south near Sunflower Landing.
History books frequently frame this specific moment as a grand geographic discovery, Soto discovering the Mississippi River.
But we must analyze the stark reality of his situation at that moment.
Think of it this way for you listening. History books often paint this as a triumphant moment of discovery.
Right.
But for Soto, looking at this mile-wide river, wearing animal skins, having lost his horses and his wealth, it must have felt like a cruel joke, just another wall to climb.
It was not a geographic triumph. It was an immense, frustrating obstacle standing in the way of his search for gold.
They could not simply ford a river of that magnitude.
No, they spent an entire month camped on the eastern bank, felling large trees and engineering complex flatboats and barges capable of transporting horses and armored men across the strong currents.
And they had to conduct this crossing under extreme duress.
They had to cross the river at night to evade the hostile indigenous fleets.
The local Mississippian groups possessed large, maneuverable canoes capable of holding dozens of warriors, and they actively patrolled the waters, harassing the Spanish construction efforts.
The expedition finally completed the treacherous crossing into present-day Arkansas on June 18, 1541.
Once they cross into Arkansas, you might assume the sheer difficulty of their situation, the constant near starvation, would humble Soto.
But the primary sources demonstrate he immediately reverts to his old habits of political manipulation to secure survival.
They enter the territory of a chiefdom called Caskey.
Archaeologists strongly identify Caskey with the Parkin site, located in Cross County, Arkansas.
It was a densely populated, heavily fortified Mississippian agricultural center.
When the Spanish arrived in July 1541, the entire region was suffering from a severe, prolonged drought, which threatened their vital maize crops.
Soto engages in a highly dramatic piece of theater here.
On July 4, 1541, his men cut down a giant cypress tree.
They fashion it into a huge wooden cross and raise it right on top of the principal Caskey temple mound, ostensibly to conduct a religious ceremony to pray for rain.
This specific event has compelling archaeological backing. In 1966, researchers excavating the Parkin site discovered the base of a large wooden post buried deep within the mound.
Radiocarbon dating placed the wood squarely in the era of the expedition.
Furthermore, excavations at the site have yielded Clarksdale brass bells, lead shot, and another chevron glass bead, cementing the physical presence of the Spanish at this location.
The Spanish accounts heavily frame this cross-raising as a noble religious conversion of the local populace. But how do modern ethnohistorians view this act? Is it genuine religion or something more cynical?
It is viewed largely as an act of indigenous diplomacy and political theater. Soto was not conducting a genuine religious mission.
He was demonstrating spiritual and military power.
By placing his immense symbol atop their most sacred architectural space, he was asserting dominance while simultaneously securing a necessary political alliance for food and safe harbor.
And that alliance immediately turns military. Soto leverages the situation, teaming up with the Caskey to attack their traditional rivals, a group called the Pacaha.
The combined Spanish and Caskey forces launch a surprise attack, driving the Pacaha from their town.
They plunder the Pacaha storehouses of their grain.
The Caskey warriors go so far as to desecrate the ancestral bones of the Pacaha elite stored in their temples, a profound insult in Mississippian culture that struck at the core of the Pacaha chief's divine authority.
Having thoroughly destabilized the regional geopolitics to secure his own provisions, Soto then steps in and brokers a forced peace treaty between the two rival chiefs.
It is a pure manipulation of local geopolitics to serve Spanish logistical needs.
After securing the provisions, the expedition moves further west along the Arkansas River, which the chronicles call the River of Chaos, heading into the rugged foothills near modern-day Batesville.
By October 1541, they encounter a highly distinct group known as the Tula people near present-day Fort Smith.
The sources note the Tula were culturally and militarily different from the Mississippian groups they had faced previously.
They were.
How did their military tactics differ?
The Tulas were a fierce, non-Mississippian people who fought utilizing long, specialized lances.
They used these lances with great skill to successfully resist and repel the Spanish cavalry charges.
The horses, which had been Soto's decisive tactical advantage at Mabila and throughout the southeast, were suddenly vulnerable to these concentrated lance formations.
They are constantly fighting. They are finding well-populated villages and vast fields of maize, but no gold. Does the realization that this is an agricultural society, not a mineral-rich empire like the Inca, start to finally break Soto's spirit?
The primary sources suggest a deep, pervasive despondency began to set in at this stage.
The constant grinding attrition of men and horses, the harsh environment, the formidable resistance of groups like the Tula, and the absolute undeniable absence of precious metals took a severe toll on the expedition's leadership.
The fundamental premise of the mission was failing.
This brings us to the final, grim phase of the expedition. The winter of 1541 to 1542 is spent at a place called Otiemque.
Here, they suffer a critical logistical and intelligence blow. Juan Ortiz, their translator, dies.
The loss of Ortiz critically crippled their operational capacity.
Without his linguistic skills, their ability to communicate complex concepts, to negotiate treaties, or to gather accurate geographical intelligence from local captives was severely compromised.
They were essentially wandering blind through a hostile landscape.
In the spring, they moved to a town called Huachoya, situated on the banks of the Mississippi River.
And on May 21, 1542, Hernando de Soto contracts a severe fever. He dies at the age of 42.
His death presented an immediate, highly dangerous tactical problem for the surviving Spanish officers.
Throughout the entire 4-year expedition, Soto had aggressively demanded to be treated by the Native Americans as an immortal sun god, an untouchable divine figure.
If the local tribes realized the supposed immortal leader had succumbed to a common fever, the psychological advantage would vanish, and the vulnerable Spanish force might be immediately overrun.
To maintain the illusion of his divinity, his men hide the corpse.
Under the cover of night, they wrap Soto's body in thick blankets, weigh it down with heavy sand, and row out into the dark waters of the Mississippi River to sink it.
The man who helped conquer the Inca and demanded to be treated as a deity ends up buried in the muddy waters of a river he viewed as nothing more than a nuisance. It is a striking fall from grace.
Following his death, command passed to his lieutenant, Luis de Moscoso Alvarado.
Moscoso and the remaining officers held a council and made the definitive decision to abandon the colonization effort entirely.
Their sole objective shifted from conquest to simple survival and escape to New Spain, which is modern-day Mexico.
In June 1542, Moscoso leads an attempt to march overland through Texas, hoping to reach Spanish settlements.
They wander through the territories of Catonan-speaking peoples, specifically the Ayes and Hasinai confederacies.
But the geography of the region defeated them.
The increasingly arid landscape of Texas lacked the vast, concentrated agricultural surpluses of the Mississippian chiefdoms they had previously encountered.
The Spanish operational model relied entirely on stealing massive amounts of stored maize.
Unable to secure enough food and water to sustain the marching army in this different ecological zone, they were forced to turn back in defeat, retracing their difficult steps all the way back to the Mississippi River.
They spend the winter of 1542 to 1543 at a place called Amoya.
For 6 months, they worked desperately to build 7 small, sturdy ships, which they called brigantines.
They have no shipyard. They are stripping metal from their own weapons, melting down crossbows and stirrups to forge crude nails, and using whatever timber they can fell, preparing to run the river to the sea.
On July 2, 1543, the makeshift fleet finally set sail downriver.
The descent was not peaceful.
They were relentlessly pursued and systematically attacked by indigenous fleets maneuvering in large, swift canoes.
The native warriors, recognizing the Spanish vulnerability on the water, would ram the Spanish vessels, drown armor-clad soldiers who fell into the river, and fire constant volleys of arrows from a safe distance.
Finally, on September 10, 1543, the exhausted survivors reached the Rio Panuco in Mexico.
Out of the 600 to 800 personnel who started the expedition, only 311 survivors make it back. It is the absolute disintegration of the original mission.
It was a total, unmitigated failure regarding its original geopolitical and economic goals.
Based on these dismal reports, the Spanish crown drastically reevaluated its stance on colonizing the region.
They concluded the territory lacked extractable mineral wealth, leaving the southeastern interior largely uncolonized by Europe for another century.
While the expedition was a failure for Spain, Its passage through the continent triggered an irreversible chain reaction for the indigenous populations they left behind.
The chronicles written by the survivors Rodrigo Rangel, Luis Hernandez de Biedma, the Gentleman of Elvas, and later Garcilaso de la Vega, are incredibly valuable to historians and anthropologists.
They remain the only written European descriptions of the Mississippian culture at its absolute height.
They describe a landscape of vast, highly organized, fortified, mound-building chiefdoms connected by complex trade networks.
Yet, by the time French and English explorers arrived in the exact same region over a century later, those huge urban chiefdoms, the palisaded towns, the centralized authority, it was entirely gone. What happened to them?
For a long time, historical narratives primarily blamed European diseases like smallpox and measles for the demographic collapse.
The theory was that novel pathogens swept through the virgin populations.
Disease was certainly a highly destructive factor. However, recent scholarly consensus points to a much more complex perfect storm of elements.
So it wasn't just a germ passing from one group to another and wiping everyone out. It was the deliberate destruction of their leadership structure, happening exactly when the climate was turning against them. It was a structural collapse.
Yes, we must examine Soto's specific military tactics. He systematically executed paramount chiefs and violently desecrated their sacred temple mounds.
We established earlier that Mississippian political and religious structures were heavily centralized, relying entirely on elites who claimed descent from the sun and derived their authority from the venerated ancestors buried in those mounds.
When Soto kills those leaders and burns those temples, he isn't just killing a politician, he is shattering the cosmological order of their entire society.
By destroying the leadership structure and proving the divine chiefs were vulnerable, Soto shattered the foundational architecture of these societies.
The central authority required to manage large populations and coordinate vast agricultural systems collapsed.
And this political decapitation is happening exactly when the regional climate is turning against them.
That is the crucial third factor. This specific era coincided with the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that caused severe, unpredictable climatic stress in North America.
This included prolonged, multi-year droughts and subsequent catastrophic crop failures.
It is a profound structural collapse. You have political and religious decapitation caused by an invading army, sudden climate change destroying the vital maize agricultural base, and the introduction of novel diseases all hitting these complex societies simultaneously.
The centralized system simply could not hold under that immense pressure.
But the people did not simply vanish. From the ashes of those centralized, vulnerable urban chiefdoms, the survivors actively reorganized.
They dispersed across the landscape and formed new, decentralized, highly resilient tribal confederacies that we recognize historically today, groups like the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee.
A decentralized confederacy is much harder to decapitate than a paramount chiefdom. The passage of the expedition was the violent catalyst that permanently altered the human and political geography of the continent.
Which brings us back to where we started. Consider that the written history of North America begins with a profound, almost tragic misunderstanding.
The Spanish were desperately reading the landscape looking for an empire of gold, entirely missing the fact that they were walking through one of the most complex, agriculturally rich, and sophisticated civilizations on the continent.
One that they documented just moments before it fractured forever. How much of our history is shaped not by what explorers actually found, but by what they were blindly expecting to see?
It is a compelling question to leave you with.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.